This episode of the Occasional Podcast is brought to you by the LSA Group, the new high-end, high-value speaker standard, and also Core Power, state-of-the-art power at real-world prices. Today's episode is also brought to you by Qobuz, lossless and high-res streaming and downloads. 50 million tracks in all genres in the best possible quality. Qobuz supports the audio industry and appreciates the needs of discerning audiophiles. Try it for free now at Qobuz.com. That's Qobuz.com. Thanks for tuning in. This is the Occasional Podcast, Season 4, Episode 8. We have a ton of information available in this podcast. I have to say, I think it's one of the most information-packed podcasts of the season. Jonathan Durda from MoFi helping us out with everything you need to know or ever will need to know about record players, spinning vinyl, purchasing, maintenance. We cover a huge swath of information in this podcast. It's a deep dive like we've never dove deep before, and I'm very excited for you guys to hear all of it. But first, just a quick item of note. If you are tuning in for all things vinyl, I did want to mention that a Tom Petty album, Wildflowers and All the Rest, recently released a multi-record album out from the late Tom Petty. And I have to say, on a personal note, I feel like this album, Wildflowers, is one of Tom Petty's best. And on top of that, it is one of the most classic road trip albums there ever was made. So if you're into vinyl and you want to give that guy a listen, it comes very well recommended from a sound perspective as well. So it is a reissue, and there's a lot of fun goodies in there. So, as we say, on with the show. Here we go. Vinyl. Everything you ever wanted to know. I also want to add one thing before we go right into the show. Today's episode is brought to you by Macintosh Laboratory. Since 1949, Macintosh has offered distinguished quality home audio products. Still handcrafted in Binghamton, New York, the iconic Macintosh Blue Watt meters are globally recognized as a symbol of quality audio. Bring your music to life with Macintosh. Visit Macintosh Labs to learn more. That's MCINTOSHLABS.com. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today on the show. A beginner's guide to buying vinyl and record players. Today, to help us explore this topic, we have the very analog proficient Jonathan Durda from MoFi Records. In regards to turntables and just record playing, vinyl, listening in general, what do you kind of feel are some of the immediate benefits, and what are the more subtle ones to listening to analog?
Sonically, whether you can measure it or not, for me in my experience, and now doing this 20 plus years, there is still something special about the way vinyl sounds. And whether you want to say that's correct or not, well, hey, that's a whole nother discussion.
I just want to point out, too, in our interview with Alex Brinkman of Auralic, we explored a bunch of stuff, like everything you wanted to know about digital audio. And he brought up a really great point that digital can be used for discovery. But once you discover a song and you listen to it, and the convenience of digital and streaming and, pulling it all down from the cloud like that is over, if you want to show your appreciation to the artist and you're a music lover, one of the ways you can do that is to buy the vinyl. They obviously get much more money on a vinyl print, and you cement that love in a physical form in a record and a vinyl, and you put it in your shelf, and it becomes part of your collection. I think it's a nice way to tip the hat towards the artist, hopefully get them a little bit more money. Obviously, it's not a lot of money, but it's something. And it's a way of cementing that in, like saying, this is a great album. So digital for discovery and analog for appreciation, I guess you could say, if we have to keep the consonant sounds the same. Just an idea, though. It's just an idea of the way to look at it.
No, you're 100% right. And I think, compared to a lot of hardware companies in the audio biz, we're unique that we have a record label with Mobile Fidelity, and so we kind of understand the licensing arrangements and where that money flows and who gets what. And Alex is 100% correct. I mean, it's your money spent is a vote to support that artist and to keep them going. And right now that they're not getting any of the touring revenue that they would normally be able to get, it's more important than ever.
So in terms of turntables, what is a good starting point in terms of dollar spend? And what do you feel is like middle of the road? What's high? How do you break out the amount of spend to the quality tiers that you've seen in your experience?
Yeah, so I mean, just to kind of clarify for the listeners a bit, when you're talking about playing back records, you need more than a turntable. You could say a cartridge is part of the turntable, but that's one unique item. You have to have a cartridge, you have to have a turntable, and you also need to have a phono preamp. So when you're thinking about budgeting, you have to take all three of those things into account. And really, without getting into pre-owned or used options, which that's a whole nother area to explore. I would say in broad terms, you probably should spend at least around $250 for something like the Audio-Technica. I think it's the LP120. Mm-hmm. That's going to be a great entry point for a lot of people, and it's a big step up from the sub $200 options that I've seen out there. So if you're just getting into vinyl or you found an old record collection you want to just play for fun, that's something that's not going to do any harm to your record collection and that you can build from and enjoy. So I think $250, hey, I mean, in 2020, that's a pretty reasonable amount of money, I think, to get a good turntable.
Yes, and you brought up a really good point. The total cost of getting into this hobby, it's a little more complicated. There's a little more mechanical moving parts, and absolutely right. If you want to get a turntable, there is also the needle, the cartridge. That's part of it, and you can change that out, and you can tinker with that. You can also tinker with the preamp. Now, some turntables have the preamp built in. Modern turntables do. But in terms of this podcast, we like to talk about things in terms of high fidelity. And part of that experience is having separate components that you can swap out to make the system your own. So I do want to tell people, there are one-stop solutions available. But in the terms of this discussion, we're going to kind of explore how to suss out all the little fun parts where you check out the needle, turn it, put a different one on, see how that sounds. How does a different preamp sound? These type of things. It's more exploratory in the sound that way, and I think for those who are drawn to the hobby, a little more fun than just having one-stop turntable with the phono preamp built in.
Yeah, 100% right, and really that's what you can expect to get in that under $500 price range. Although there's some unique options there too. So I think if you're talking about a more high performance territory, budgeting somewhere around $500 to $1,000, you're going to start getting into that audiophile performance, and you're going to get a nice setup where you can choose an external phono preamp, not one that's built into the turntable. Your best value in that price range is still probably going to be a turntable that comes bundled with a cartridge, but you will be getting a turntable that's good enough to support future cartridge upgrades. So you're going to have that upgrade path as you kind of explore. And, what I try to just really guide people to do when you're budgeting, just get the best turntable you can afford, because that's the foundation of your vinyl playback system. That's something that you have to look at, every day. It's usually on the top of your equipment cabinet or your console or whatever. So, the way it looks and feels and operates, I mean, it's hands-on. So you want something built really well that's high performance, reliable, but again, that you can build on that upgrade path, because you can always change the phono preamp, you can always change the cartridge. So, but again, getting into that $500 to $1,000 price range, you can get something really nice that's going to last you a long time and sound really great.
Once you have that turntable, what would you say is the first thing that you would upgrade to that turntable, given the phono, preamp, and the cartridge options? Do you think there's a particular cartridge that really speaks to you, or a particular preamp that once you upgrade it becomes like, wow?
If you're going to start with that, and assuming you went to a good audio shop, you found some high value products already that are going to suit you, before you spend any more money, I would recommend making sure your system is set up properly. Because that's I know it's not really answering your question directly, but that's one of the differences of a CD player or a DAC with a streamer versus a turntable. There's a mechanical component to it, like you mentioned earlier, that calibrating this system is going to make a huge difference in the way it sounds. So it doesn't even matter if you just spent $200 or $500, $5,000, $50,000. The setup will make or break the performance of that system. So first do that, and we can talk more in detail about what that all entails. But assuming you've done that, the next thing I would recommend that you would buy is perhaps something to put your turntable on. If you don't already have a nice audio rack that's really solid and stable, or a really nice piece of furniture, because this is something that's reading these tiny grooves and it's really affected by vibrations, experimenting with a platform, an isolation platform or feet that will help isolate your turntable, that would probably be the next area that I would explore to improve your system.
Interesting. In terms of the turntable itself, there are several types of mechanisms that allow the turntable to spin, to turn. Can you just explain a couple of those different ways to make the table turn, and what's your take on each of them?
Yeah, I mean, most people are going to consider, when you're looking at a turntable, it's going to be either a belt drive or a direct drive turntable. So, a belt drive, you basically have a motor that's away from the platter that the record sits on, and then you have a belt attached to the motor pulley and then to the platter, and that's what spins the platter. With a direct drive, it's going to be generally underneath, coupled to the platter, and there's no belt involved. And in very broad terms, a belt drive turntable is going to do a better job at keeping the noise generated by that motor away from the record surface, while a direct drive turntable, again, generally speaking, is going to have a more precise speed accuracy. And there's other pros and cons to both, but all that being said, there's also excellent examples of both approaches, and there's bad examples of both approaches. So this isn't a PlayStation versus Xbox kind of argument to have, or whatever, anytime that Coke versus Pepsi, whatever example you want to use. A great designer and engineer, they're going to know the pros and cons of both, and they can generally balance out the drawbacks to get really great results. So, unless you have a very specific requirement, so like a DJ, which I think, we all probably had a dream of being a DJ at one point and got a pair of Technics turntables. You want direct drive turntables because some of the benefits are the torque and responsiveness of those direct drive motors. So that's why DJs pick direct drives. But other than that, knowing the drive mechanism, it's not going to really tell you much about how the overall turntable is going to perform.
Okay. In terms of the needles that you can put on these turntables, there's two types called moving magnet and one called moving coil. And I was lucky enough to be perusing Facebook right before we joined, and I saw a definition posted in a thing, and I'll give credit to the Facebook for this. But this guy writes, and in terms of an explanation of the two, a moving magnet takes the vibrating needle and creates a magnetic field in a set of magnets. A moving coil cartridge effectually reverses the design of a moving magnet cartridge. A small coil is mounted at the end of the cantilever, and this is suspended in a magnetic field. Because the coil can be significantly smaller than the magnet, the inertial weight on the cantilever is reduced and the performance of the cartridge improved. It is basically doing the same thing, but a lighter weight cartridge. MM versus MC, we'll go with the initials here. What's your take on the two, and do you have a preference?
Yeah, I guess, one concern I have about this whole conversation is that I don't want people to think vinyl playback is something that you need a PhD to get into. Yeah, but, you can't help but get into conversations like this and start talking. When you mention inertia, it's like, yeah, that's a big part of one thing you're controlling or trying to control or work with, because you can't really control it in vinyl playback. So anyone who's golfed before, you might see on your drivers like moment of inertia or MOI. That same thing is applicable in both your tone arm and in your cartridge. So when you're talking about mass, with the coils being lighter than magnets, that basically means that the needle or the stylus and cantilever can be much more responsive to the modulations in the groove wall of the record. So what does that mean? That means when you're listening to it, you're going to get more detail, you're going to get more accurate tracking, you're going to just get more spatial information, textures. I mean, that's what's going to end up coming through your speakers when you're comparing an MC versus an MM. However, there's a trade-off. An MC cartridge is going to have much lower output than an MM cartridge. So an MM with those moving magnets, especially, these more powerful like neodymium magnets, you're going to get more output voltage. So if an MC has less voltage, that means that your phono preamp now becomes very, very critical because you need to boost the gain exponentially more. You're going from boosting it hundreds of times to thousands of times. And so the signal-to-noise ratio and THD and all that of that circuit becomes critical to the overall performance. And that's really hard to do. I mean, you're dealing with teeny tiny signals with both MM and MC, but especially with MC. So there's a balancing act there. And in general, what you'll find is there's a lot of great MM cartridges, especially at the more affordable end of the chain. And if you're spending up to about $1,000, you're going to find mostly MMs. If you're going above $1,000, then you can really start getting to MC territory. And the main reason for that is they're harder to build. They're harder to build right. They cost more. So, like all things in life, it's all about balance and trade-offs. So, in the high end, it's generally accepted that MCs are going to be overall superior, but man, MMs certainly do have a place and can still offer great performance.
Now, that technical spec associated with the cartridge, there are also, and you're absolutely right, I don't want to scare anybody off thinking this. You can buy a turntable and just have it, go, and once you have it set up, you can check for these things. But to your point, if you want to get into it, there's a lot more stuff to fiddle with, and some people really enjoy it. Being able to fine-tune it and work with your hands and this kind of thing. But if we're diving just a little bit deeper, there's also different types of needles.
Yeah, so, a needle is made up of two components, a stylus, which is the rock, the diamond usually, that's actually touching the record, and then the cantilever, which is that pipe that actually is holding the stylus in place and then connecting it to the rest of the cartridge. And then there's a suspension holding all of that. So, I mean, it's a pretty complicated small device. I remember talking to Peter Letterman from Soundsmith, and he's saying how, building a cartridge is way harder than building like a Swiss mechanical watch. Mm-hmm. You're dealing with microscopic components and very tight tolerances. But in terms of needles or stylus profiles, as we'd refer to them, you can find things that are conical or spherical, which is basically like a rounded off stone. It's not multifaceted. It's just kind of literally a half moon shape. Then you have elliptical, which is a bit more complex. And that's what you're going to find in a lot of high-value cartridges. And then when you go up the line, you get profiles that are called microline or Shibata. I mean, there's a ton of them out there. And really what you're trying to do as you go up the line and you get these more complex shapes is mimic the same profile of the stylist used on the cutter head that, created the original lacquer that the records come from. So if you think about that, if you're going all the way back to the mastering studio, it starts to make sense that stone is going to leave a particular shape to the groove wall, and you want to be able to track that groove wall accurately. The diamond should be the same shape as what was used at the studio. And microline styluses, or styli is the plural of stylus, are going to give you a more accurate representation. And so there's a lot of different benefits to that besides just getting more accuracy and more detail. One side effect that most people would be surprised to learn is you're also going to hear less of that surface noise.
Oh, really?
So less, because it's going deeper in the groove wall, it's tracking it more accurately. So if you have especially like a used record collection that might have some blemishes on the top layer of the record, you're actually going to hear more of those surface noises with a rounded off spherical stylus than you will with a more complex one. So there's a lot of benefits to that.
Originally, I didn't have it planned out to keep going, but I'm going to add this in here. We're going to work our way through all the parts, because now I'm really intrigued to have your take on what the tone arms are. So the tone arm is obviously the arm that comes out that holds the cartridge, and there you can buy different types, different lengths. Anything to add there?
Oh man, yeah. I mean, tone arms. There's not been a lot of innovation in tone arms in the last few decades, really. So there's basically two main types you're gonna to find. One is going to be called a Gimbaled style tone arm, and when we're talking about Gimbaled, we're talking about literally how the arm pivots. So we're talking pivoted arms that have a center point that they pivot from, and they have to both go up and down, and they have to go left and right. And they should do that freely and with very little friction, well, the least amount of friction as possible. And so a gimbaled arm is using ball bearing races to be able to move freely left or right. And then you have a unipivot arm, which is going to be the other most common type of tone arm implementation, where quite simply you have the same center pivot point that the arm is basically resting on the head of a pin. So if you can imagine, that's one single point of contact that allows the arm to move freely in all directions. And again, like the direct drive versus belt drive, there's not one that is always going to be better than the other. I remember back, I don't know, this was probably in the 1970s, Grado wrote a great white paper about this and had a lot of reasons why unipivot was inherently better. And it all makes sense, but it all boils down to execution and tolerances and manufacturing. And then on top of that, you have usability. So after knowing hundreds, if not thousands of customers and getting their feedback, you find that there's certain people, man, they just hate the way unipivots kind of feel in their hand. It's almost too free. They feel like the tone arm is going to fly off the turntable and they're going to break something. They like the security and feel of a gimbaled arm. So there's a lot that goes into it. There's excellent examples of both. We work with both often here. Yeah, I mean, there's not a simple formula to say always buy this technology, always buy a 9-inch tone arm or a 10-inch or a 12-inch. It all has to work together. A turntable and an arm and a cartridge, it's a complete system that has to work together. And this is where finding an expert yourself that can help guide you will pay off huge dividends.
So we've worked our way through the turntable, and if you're still with us, I just want to add one more technical component. Let's talk about the preamp itself. If you're going separates and it's not built in, do you have any recommendations for entry-level preamp that you like, or anything you've noticed in general about that particular category of product?
Well, the first thing that you have to ask yourself is, what cartridge am I going to be using? So if you're using an MC cartridge, you're going to need to find a phono preamp that has more gain. And typically that's going to mean 60 dB. That's how they measure the gain on a phono preamp, 60 dB or more with a moving coil. Now, you also have high output moving coils. You have the MM cartridges, and those are generally going to be more in that 40 to 50 dB of gain range. So you want to make sure you have enough gain to use in a phono preamp to use with the cartridge you plan on putting on your turntable. Beyond that, without sounding too self-serving, I mean, we make an excellent phono preamp for around $299 under the MoFi brand. That's going to be a really great option for a lot of people. But phono preamps, man, you'll find that they go anywhere from $20 to $30,000 and beyond. So there's a pretty wide range to choose from.
So we talked about the turntable. Now we're going to talk about the records that go on the turntables, the vinyl itself. I think one of the classic examples that's very commonly overlooked in this thing is that, not right now because we're in the middle of the COVID, but there is a super kind of interesting atmosphere and nostalgia and enjoyment that some people get from actually going to the record shop. I can't stress this enough. It's like there's a cool vibe there. The people are usually cool. If you guys have ever seen High Fidelity, the movie, or even the TV show, it's like a place to go to really celebrate music. That's one place, obviously, you can buy vinyl if you can find one in your town. You have any other suggestions for places to shop for vinyl?
Man, shopping at record stores is one of my favorite things to do in life. And right now with COVID, I'm missing it bad. Although a lot of record stores have opened back up and they're, letting a certain number of people in and they're taking all these social distancing measures to heart. So those opportunities are out there. But, finding things that you never would have thought of just by flipping through the bins, that's not really easy to replicate online. Going with friends, getting turned on to new music, new artists, inevitably somebody's going to pull out an album and they have a story to tell about the first time they heard that album and what it means to them. So that's another thing that's special about vinyl and kind of touches on what Alex was talking about with having a record collection. You won't get that anywhere else but in a record store. So highly encourage people, shop at your local record stores, or, going out of town when we used to be able to travel. Man, that was always a blast, finding, the cool local record store. But, shopping online can be great. Obviously, our sister company, Music Direct, is a great place to buy records. If you're looking for something that's out of print or an older record, an original, Discogs is an incredible resource for research and for their marketplace of hard to find LPs. So Discogs is great. I don't want to be anti-Amazon, but, Amazon is kind of the low-hanging fruit. You don't necessarily get a lot out of that experience other than, your 2-day Prime shipping. So there's other expert record stores online, Music Direct, Elusive Disc, Acoustic Sounds. All these guys are great. They have people on the phones that you can talk to that know music, that know the differences between pressings. So you can get a good experience online. But again, if you're trying to find that hard out-of-print stuff, Discogs or finding, hitting gold at the local Goodwill sometimes can also be a thrill.
So what are some of the variables that one can find in purchasing a record? I think one of the examples I always think about is that there are different weights. And you had mentioned, too, there's different pressings that can actually affect the value and also, of course, the sound. Is there anything in particular one would look at when shopping to hopefully get the best sound one way or the other?
Yeah, I think what you'll find with record weight, that's not an indication of sound quality. That's just marketing. Anytime, look, I'm in marketing. Anytime we can put a number on something and try to make it really clear that there's something that makes A superior to B, we like to do that. But unfortunately, what inevitably happens is that other people will, take that and apply it to their product, but it doesn't really offer any benefit. So record weight, the only benefit that's really kind of possible from having a 180 gram versus 140 gram or a 200 gram is that it's going to tend to be a little bit stiffer, might be a little bit more difficult for it to warp, whether it's stored improperly or through the mail or what have you. But I haven't found there to be a consistent sound quality difference. Anybody that can probably cite a time where they said, oh, well, no, this 180 grams sounded better than this other weight, but it's just not consistent. So that's not really a good reason to buy something. I think what you want to look at is who mastered the record, and you can look at that either by the record label, like a Mobile Fidelity, or you can look at the actual mastering engineer themselves. So if you really do deep dives, and you can find this on Discogs, and there's a lot of people in the YouTube community that will kind of tell you, oh, man, this guy's a great mastering engineer. That way you'll have at least a higher probability of getting something that really sounds good as opposed to something that was literally just pressed as a money-making opportunity for a record label, because there's a lot of that. There's a lot of, vinyl's hot right now. Let's just put out this album on vinyl, and we're going to go from a digital master or even an MP3 master, but it'll be on vinyl and all the hipster kids will love it. Well, that's not what this is really about. So there does have to be a little bit of buyer beware and try to find a trusted source, whether that's the retailer you work with, the record label, the mastering engineer. Those are the details to look at. And thankfully, again, places like Discogs can help outline that information.
All right, so now that we have our records, we have our turntable, how do we maintain the records so they sound the best? Because one of the things that bothers me about vinyl that you don't really see in digital is the surface noise. I know some people love it, but I've heard vinyl at audio shows sound as pristine as digital in every single form. So how do we get that type of playback out of our records and keep it that way?
That kind of ties into your last question a little bit. I'll get into what a consumer can do, but right away, there might be nothing they can do. So depending on where that record is pressed, you'll find certain pressing plants can create very quiet vinyl. And that can either do with the presses themselves, the operator of those presses, the formula of the vinyl pellets makes an impact. Of course, the mastering, who cut the lacquer. I mean, all that stuff, it all makes an impact. So a lot of times, if you're buying, kind of mass-produced, money-grabbing vinyl presses, it doesn't matter if you clean the thing 1,000 times, it's still going to have inherent noise because it picked it up somewhere along the way and it's now in the grooves. Assuming that's not the case, you're getting a good quality record. The first thing you should do before even playing it, I feel like we're getting nerdy again, but you should clean it. You should clean it before you even play it because record pressing plants are not laboratories. They don't have clean rooms. The guys aren't wearing hairnets and gloves. I mean, it's a factory. So clean the record. There's also, some people think about the what's called the mold release compound, which allows the record to come off the press. Some of that could be still on the surface of the record. So clean the record. We make a half dozen different record cleaning solutions ourselves, things like Super Record Wash. We even have an enzyme cleaner that if you found an old record collection in your parents' basement and you want to make sure there's no mold and you want to do a deep clean, we have cleaners for that. So there's a lot of different solutions, literally solutions out there. There's a lot of different brushes to use. I'll say this, if you have a large record collection, it's worth buying a good record cleaning machine as opposed to doing all this hand washing and hand drying because it can be a pretty laborious process. So buy a record cleaning machine. You can find a good one for $500 to $600 starting out for something that's really nice and semi-automated. But like anything in life, you can go up to thousands of dollars and get an even better record cleaning machine. Another option that a lot of people probably don't think about, you can go find your local hi-fi shop. A lot of these guys have these machines and will let you come in and clean your records on these really fancy machines for a very modest fee. That's another option. If you don't want to plop down hundreds or thousands of dollars up front, you can take 10, 20 records on a weekend over to your hi-fi dealer, use their machine, get to know some great people. So there's a lot of ways to do this. I would say avoid some of the cheap solutions out there that make big promises. They don't pay off typically. You're not going to get perfect results with a $20 brush. So, cleaning records, definitely important to keep your collection pristine, to get the best sound. But yeah, man, we could talk an hour or longer about all the different ways you could do that.
So now we have the records cleaned. You see where I'm going with this, right? We have the records clean. We have the turntable.
I never know where you're going.
So we have them cleaned. We have the records. We have the turntable. How do you like to store your records?
Yeah, storing records is a challenge because, really nice furniture to store your records in, man, it's expensive. That's just money you're not spending on records. So I think we all try to look for things that will store our records for the least amount of money, per title stored in them. And you have the ubiquitous IKEA, I think it's called the Calyx now, used to be the Expedit. That's a staple, man. Mm-hmm. Like for storing records, there's not a better value than that I've found. My one tip, if you do go down to IKEA and buy one of these Calyxes, tack on. It doesn't have to be a really big piece of wood, but tack on like a thin piece of wood on the back of the cabinet to keep you from pushing your records too far into the cabinet and maybe falling out the back or having this really kind of ugly staggered look of your records. This will allow them to all kind of present evenly, not get pushed out. And, it's a quick project. You can go to your hardware store, get a big sheet of thin wood and just tack that on. And that'll be a huge improvement. Not just for that, it also helps with stability sometimes of these cabinets. So
they tend to wiggle a little. Also, I think in a really basic term, you do want to store them vertically, right? Because the groove, if you store them stacked on top of each other, you could cause some damage. I'm guessing that's appropriate.
Yeah, you don't want to stack them long. You referenced High Fidelity earlier. That's one of my favorite scenes. Is where John Cusack is, or Rob, he's called in the movie, is organizing his record collection, and his employees ask him, "Well, how are you doing it? It's not alphabetical. No, he's doing it autobiographically." And all the records were stacked, and he's like, "Well, you really shouldn't stack those records." Okay. So yeah, we can get super anal retentive when it comes to to vinyl and records and how you store them. But yes, definitely stack them vertically. You don't want them leaning. That's how you get warped records. You don't want to pack them in too tight. So there's a balancing act to all of that. So beyond the IKEA piece, Symbol Audio is another cool brand that makes some beautiful furniture for your hi-fi and for storing records. We also import a rack from a company called Solid Steel, which is made in Italy, that will store your equipment and your records. So if you're thinking about putting something in the living room and you just want to have 50, 60, 70, 100 records, whatever, in that room, those are great options. But for big libraries, man, it's definitely hard to beat that IKEA stuff.
The records itself, we typically categorize them in the category of analog reproduction. One of the other tools at our disposal is amplification in the category of analog reproduction in the state of tubes amplification instead of solid state. Do you have any kind of input on, do you think it's too much analog with tubes? Does it sound better because they're both analog? Solid state versus tube in the amplification stage. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm on a desert island and that desert island has power, I'm probably going to be a tube amplifier guy at heart. However, when you're talking about phono preamplifiers, I would recommend most people stick to solid state on that, especially if you're shopping in that 3-digit to low 4-digit price range. And that's just because a lot of tube designs, I mean, they all look cool. I mean, they have the cool factor down, but they can be noisy. And when we were talking earlier about how many times you have to amplify these small signals coming from a phono cartridge, a good, well-executed solid-state design is going to be quieter. It's going to have less noise. But again, some people dig that. Some people dig the noise part. That's not what I'm doing this for, but some people do. And so do whatever you think sounds best to your ears. But I would say solid state's going to be great for that. Now, if you're getting into super high-end territory, it doesn't matter. I mean, you can get great sounding tubes or solid state. So, pick your flavor.
So in terms of turntables, what are the best qualities to look for in each price range, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think the qualities would apply to any price range. You want to look for something that is obviously well-made. Typically at the lower end price ranges, you're going to have products that are made out of particle board or plastic, and there's going to be a certain level of performance and durability with those. Beyond the obvious fit and finish and build quality, you want to look for things like, is it adjustable and upgradable? So can I change on the entry level? You sometimes you can't even change the cartridge that you're going to end up using. The tone arm won't support other cartridges. So you want to look for that. You want to look for on a tone arm, on a higher end turntable, does it have enough adjustability for tracking force for different weight cartridges? Does it have a VTA adjustment, which is the height of the tone arm? The more adjustment it has, the more flexible it's going to be in the future. And I'd say, just as general advice, you want to look at, who is this company that makes this? Where is it made? And do they have a good track record of building it? Because, man, I'll tell you, building turntables is hard. Putting it on paper and having concepts, that's the easy part. But executing it in real life when you're dealing with super small tolerances and a lot of, machining work, it's hard to do it correctly. So who you buy it from is important. How they're going to offer you service after you buy it, should you run into an issue, that's going to be more important with a turntable than it is, a lot of modern kind of solid state equipment. And then, my last tip on a personal level, I like really well executed simple designs. I think that offers you a better experience long term than something highly complex. So while something complex can look really cool, you just have to remember there's generally going to be more maintenance, more setup, more pain and suffering involved to get the full pleasure out of a complex product.
And in terms of suspension for turntables, what's your take on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, there we get into something that's relatively complex to do correctly, but man, a lot of iconic turntables do use sprung suspensions. I mean, it all started with AR, Acoustic Research, Garrard, Thorns, Oracle, Soda, another American turntable, and of course, Lynn in their LP12 famously uses a sprung suspension. So I think it's a proven concept for sure. And the reason you'd even want a turntable suspended, it's you want it suspended from the acoustic output of your system, other vibrations from the floor,
right?
The air.
And just to interrupt you here, real quick, that's what makes the Crosby the laughing stock of audiophiles everywhere. If you have one, I apologize in advance. But when the speakers are in the same cabinet as the turntable, that's no bueno.
Yeah. I mean, Crosley is interesting because what do those things go for? $50, $75? Like, how can you even make something with so much in it and charge only $50 to $75? So I try not to make fun of the that product or the people who buy it. I recognize we all start somewhere.
We all start somewhere, absolutely. Yeah.
We all start somewhere, man. Like, my first system was a Fisher boombox. Like, come on. So, we all start somewhere. I think it's important, though, that we let people start somewhere and we just show them, hey, there's other options and this isn't the end game. But, yeah, start there. But you're right. That thing isn't designed for performance. It's designed for utility and a certain kind of customer. But beyond that, when you're talking about high-end turntables, so again, you want that turntable suspended from the sound from your system, other vibrations, and especially if your system can produce deep bass. I'm talking like 20 hertz or lower, even sometimes bass. You should have something with a sprung suspension. But there are downsides. Again, it's tends to be more expensive, more complex. These sprung suspensions have to be tuned by somebody who knows how to set those things up, and sometimes they have to be retuned over the course of time. So there's a bit more maintenance involved, but it's a great solution if done right. And, for us, in our MoFi turntables, we addressed this issue with a foot made by a guy named Mike Latvis from Harmonic Resolution Systems. But instead of springs, it's using a proprietary polymer that also kind of acts as a spring to damp those vibrations to allow that turntable to have 6 degrees of isolation from 20 hertz all the way up to 20 kilohertz. And man, it made a huge difference compared to your typical rubber foot that you'll find on the bottom of a lot of turntables. So this is an important thing to keep in mind when buying any turntables. How is that turntable going to be isolated from vibrations? If it's not built into the turntable, and a lot of tables don't have a built-in solution, you can do some things like buy a platform we mentioned earlier that will isolate the turntable with like an air bladder system, or they'll have opposing magnets to float the turntable, so you have this gap of air. So that's pretty cool. Another affordable way to do that is to put your turntable on a wall shelf. Just getting it off the floor makes a huge difference. Now, you can't do that in every home, but that's probably the least expensive, highest impact you can make in terms of isolating your turntable. So lots of cool ways to do it.
And do you have any general tips in terms of turntable setup? That was a tongue twister.
There are some fundamentals that you should follow with a turntable. So putting it on a solid and stable surface. One thing beside calling vinyls that drives me crazy is when I see these Instagram posts where people have their turntable on top of their amplifier or their receiver. I'm just like that's so wrong on so many levels. I get it if it looks cool, but that's not going to give you a good sound. You want to put your table on its own solid, stable, and level surface. So making sure your turntable is level is an easy thing to get the best performance. You just get one of those little dollar spirit levels. Make sure that thing is leveled out. That's step one. Every turn, I don't care how much you spend, it should be level. The other easy thing without buying anything like proprietary, any expensive tools, is you can check the speed of your turntable. So if your turntable has a pitch adjustment, sometimes you'll have what are called motor controllers with speed adjustment to fine-tune the speed of the platter. You can get apps on your phone. If you have an Android, I use the RPM Speed and Wow app. For iOS, Apple, there's the RPM Turntable Speed Accuracy app. Those are both great, and I've compared those both to using professional systems and using strobes, and they're all within like 0.01% of each other in terms of what they read out. So you can spend $1 or $5 on an app and have a great solution to just make sure that your platter is rotating at the correct speed, 33.33 or 45 RPM, depending on what you're playing back. And if you have a table that allows you to adjust that, you can really dial in that speed accurately without really spending any money. Beyond that, when you start talking about cartridge setup, you're going to have to invest in tools. You're going to have to, bone up on some knowledge. You're going to take chance of breaking something, quite honestly. So this is where a good audio store comes in. They have the tools needed to do this right. But if you want to learn how to do it yourself in depth, I would suggest doing a YouTube search. I think there's probably some videos of Michael Fremer from Stereophile who's done some excellent seminars, very in-depth on the subject, that you should be able to find online. He even had a DVD called 21st Century Vinyl, which I'm not sure if that's available anymore, but if you can find that, you really want to learn how to set up a turntable. He's provided a lot of content for people to learn how to do it properly.
Well, this has been very educational. There's so much information. And just to keep in mind, there's a lot to it, but again, it's really kind of a fun little hobby for you if you want to get into the detail. This is a mechanical beast. And when you think about it, it's actually so advanced considering how old the technology is. I mean, this is recorded sound at its most primal, I think. We've had this idea for so long, and the way they've readjusted and refined every mechanical working part to it is just really a testament to some great design work and engineering. But if you're fully into this, there's a lot that you can tinker with. But still, just a really great wealth of information. Thank you so much, John, for chiming in on this one.
Thanks, Brian. It's been fun.
Thank you for listening to The Occasional Podcast, Season 4. The Occasional Podcast is a production of the Part-Time Audiophile Network, which includes parttimeaudiophile.com, The Occasional Magazine, the PTA newsletter, and audiohead.com. You can stay in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The Occasional Podcast is produced and hosted by Brian Hunter, executive produced by Scott Hall at PTA Productions. If you haven't already, please subscribe to The Occasional Podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.